In the spring of 1811, the floorboards of an old Richmond tobacco warehouse groaned under the weight of secrets that had slept for decades. Workers prying up rotten wood discovered 8 identical wooden boxes, each containing a man's wedding ring and a small vial of powder so faint it could have been mistaken for dust. 8 men, 8 marriages, 8 deaths, all linked to a single name, Ruth Holloway, a widow who had somehow outlived 8 husbands in just 30 years. On the surface, Ruth appeared as a refined lady of Virginia society, a healer, a widow deserving sympathy. But beneath that polished veneer lurked a mind capable of orchestrating death with the precision of a surgeon. The magistrate who first learned of the warehouse discovery ordered the case sealed, citing delicate matters of reputation, and so it remained buried for more than 2 centuries. Tonight we peel back that seal. Tonight we uncover the story no history book dared to tell, the story of a woman who transformed grief into power, and power into lethal vengeance. Before we continue, understand this: what you are about to hear is not idle gossip. These were men whose lives were measured in months, whose deaths were deliberate, orchestrated, and invisible to the law. Their fates were not accidents. They were the design of a mind that knew every secret, every vulnerability, and how to exploit it. Ruth Holloway was not merely a widow. She was a force that manipulated the social, medical, and political systems around her to deadly perfection. By the end of this journey, you will see that society itself, its laws, its customs, its blind trust and reputation, was complicit in her reign of death. And the question you must ask yourself is this: if one person could exploit a society so completely, what truths are still hidden, just out of sight, waiting to be discovered by those willing to look tonight? The quiet streets of Richmond, the genteel parlors, the whispered conversations, they are all part of the canvas upon which Ruth painted her lethal masterpiece. Keep your eyes open, your mind alert, and your assumptions suspended. What seems ordinary is never what it appears to be, and in the shadows of this story you may begin to see the hidden mechanics of power, manipulation, and survival. Ruth Holloway arrived in Richmond in the autumn of 1782, a striking widow of 28, with hair the color of burnished copper and eyes like winter fog, carrying the air of someone who had suffered yet survived, and a story that demanded sympathy: the death of her husband, a Continental Army officer, at Yorktown. She claimed loss, yet she brought with her knowledge far beyond that of most women of her age, a command of Latin, an encyclopedic understanding of medicinal herbs, and a skill for healing that made her indispensable to the gentry desperate for care in a land where physicians were scarce and remedies rudimentary. The Virginia elite welcomed her with open arms, offering her entry into their parlors, their drawing rooms, their trust, and in return, Ruth offered what appeared to be only kindness, intelligence, and refinement. But beneath her cultivated demeanor and soft-spoken manner, there was calculation, a deliberate gathering of power and influence. She understood the vulnerabilities of men whose lives were built on wealth, reputation, and secrets, men who had survived revolution and seized opportunity in its aftermath, often at the expense of others. Within months, she had married Colonel Edmund Fairfax, a robust tobacco merchant, one of the region's most prominent figures, and less than 6 months later, he was found dead in his study, clutching his stomach, moaning in agony, while Ruth hovered near him with a cup of tea she had prepared, a cup that would silently transform her grief into wealth and status. Dr. Harrison, summoned in haste, recorded the cause as gastric fever, oblivious to the fact that the remedy Ruth administered had been perfected in secret during her time in Philadelphia with the disgraced physician Dr. Marcus Wainwright, a man who had discovered plant alkaloids capable of mimicking natural illness while leaving no trace in the body. Ruth's methods were surgical, her preparation meticulous, and her timing flawless. Each husband succumbed under circumstances that seemed ordinary to the outside world, yet each death consolidated her social position and her fortune. The slave community, invisible to the law but not to observation, whispered of her uncanny abilities, noting the patterns of illness, the insistence that no other physician intervene, the solitary walks she took to gather herbs, the locked chests in which she kept her instruments, the white powders she hid behind walls, all traces of a hidden system of control that turned trust into death. And as the gentry celebrated her mourning, unaware they were witnessing performance, Ruth was already plotting the next step in a sequence of calculated marriages, each designed to target men who had betrayed her first husband, men whose lives were to pay the price of their secrets. Her intelligence, charm, and apparent vulnerability were weapons, and Richmond itself, with its opulent plantations and fragile social codes, became the arena for a game of vengeance that would claim 8 men before it reached its final act. By January of 1784, Ruth had already set her sights on Captain William Randolph, a shipping magnate whose fortune had been built running supplies to the Continental Army, a man whose reputation for honor and courage made him appear untouchable. To the public, their courtship was swift but socially appropriate, a widow finding companionship with a man of substance, yet beneath the appearances, Ruth had selected him with the same precision as she had Colonel Fairfax, another member of the clandestine network that had betrayed her first husband during the war. Within months of marriage, Randolph began complaining of intense stomach pain, weakness, and nausea, mirroring the symptoms that had felled Fairfax, and Ruth, ever attentive, administered her family remedies with a calm and measured hand, never leaving his side, never calling another physician. The symptoms escalated quickly as Dr. Harrison, again summoned, watched in confusion while the robust captain collapsed under his care, convulsing in a manner that mimicked natural illness so perfectly that no doctor could detect the hand of malice. Outside, the servants whispered, aware of the pattern, passing knowledge silently among themselves, but powerless to act in a society that denied them authority or voice. The rituals Ruth performed were methodical. Her walks to the forest to collect herbs, her locked chest of powders and tinctures, her secret journal of formulas that could heal or kill depending on dosage, all evidence of a mind operating beyond morality, beyond law, and yet perfectly in harmony with the social structures that protected her. Randolph's death, like Fairfax's, left Ruth wealthy, socially admired, and above suspicion, her reputation as the grieving widow intact and her influence in Richmond's elite circles deepening. Even Dr. Wainwright, who had initially guided her knowledge of plant toxins, began to see that Ruth was no longer a pupil but a master, her motives transcending profit to something far darker and more personal, a meticulously calculated campaign of vengeance designed to punish those who had betrayed loyalty, honor, and life itself. And as the gentry praised her composure, invited her to salons, and mourned her misfortunes, Ruth quietly marked her next target, each death a step in a sequence that would ultimately expose the hidden machinery of treachery that had shaped Virginia's post-revolutionary society. By now, her reputation as healer, scholar, and widow created a shield so impenetrable that even whispers of suspicion were dismissed. Yet every gesture, every cup of tea, every smile was a calculated part of her lethal choreography. Richmond was unaware that within its elegant homes, the most refined parlors, and the bustling docks, a single woman was bending the threads of fate itself, one husband at a time, transforming grief into power, suspicion into fortune, and society's blind trust into the perfect instrument of death. By mid-1785, Ruth Holloway had turned her gaze toward Judge Thomas Henley, a prominent member of the Virginia House of Delegates, a man whose intellect and status made him a figure of public admiration and whose trust in Ruth would seal his fate. Their courtship was brief but intense, a union celebrated as a triumph of love overcoming tragedy. Yet beneath the ceremonial smiles and lavish invitations, Ruth's motives were precise and unyielding. Within 7 months of marriage, during a dinner party attended by Richmond's most influential citizens, Henley complained of a sudden, severe digestive distress after Ruth served him a special tonic, a concoction she claimed had been passed down through her family. The judge, known for his robust constitution and even temperament, quickly faltered, clutching his stomach, his discomfort escalating into violent convulsions before he collapsed at the center of his own drawing room. Witnesses were shocked, unable to comprehend the speed and severity of his illness, while Ruth maintained her composure, summoning Dr. Harrison with perfectly timed urgency, allowing the symptoms to mimic a natural ailment that would leave no evidence of her hand. Within hours, Henley was dead, and Ruth's grief, again expertly performed, earned her even greater admiration, her social standing untouched by the horror she had wrought in plain sight. Among the enslaved and domestic staff, however, awareness of the pattern had hardened into certainty. They observed her rituals, the solitary forest walks, the locked chests of powders, the meticulous preparation of remedies that could heal or kill, and shared their knowledge quietly, preserving it as a hidden archive of truth. With each death, Ruth not only amassed wealth, but cultivated the illusion of innocence, weaving herself deeper into Richmond society, ensuring that suspicion would be dismissed as misfortune, fortune, or coincidence. By now, the rhythm of her killings was almost ceremonial, a dark choreography she executed with surgical precision, each husband selected not at random, but for their connection to the secret wartime network that had betrayed her first husband, each death calculated to avoid detection while maximizing gain. Ruth had become a master of manipulation, exploiting not only the vulnerabilities of the men she married, but the blindness of a society that valued reputation over scrutiny, etiquette over inquiry, and performance over reality. And yet, beneath her outward success, a storm was gathering. Dr. Marcus Wainwright, who had first taught her the means to kill without trace, had begun to realize that Ruth's ambition, her vengeance, and her cunning exceeded anything he had ever envisioned, and he began to sense that he was no longer an ally, but a potential liability in a campaign that was only growing more audacious, more ruthless, and closer to the point of revealing the hidden corruption embedded in the very fabric of Virginia's elite. The deaths of Ruth Holloway's fourth and fifth husbands marked a turning point in the rhythm of her campaign, a pattern of precision and audacity that was beginning to ripple through Richmond society even as the public remained blissfully unaware. George Carrington, a wealthy plantation owner, succumbed in 1787 to acute dyspepsia, a sudden collapse that mirrored the previous husband's mysterious illnesses. Yet Ruth's public display of mourning was flawless, drawing sympathy and admiration from those around her, while she quietly absorbed his vast estate. The following year, Samuel Bradford, a prominent merchant whose influence stretched across Virginia's trade networks, fell victim to nervous fever, again after consuming a remedy administered by Ruth herself. Observers were baffled by the recurrence of such illnesses, but the sophistication of Ruth's methods, her careful selection of herbs, the precise dosages, the timing of administration, ensured that no autopsy, no physician's inspection could uncover the truth. Among the enslaved staff, whispers grew into cautious chronicles. Jupiter, Caesar, and others exchanged information about vials hidden behind walls, powders that smelled faintly of almonds, the way Ruth personally prepared every dose and insisted no other physician intervene. Each death, each inheritance, each increase in social standing tightened the invisible web she had spun, connecting her to Richmond's elite with threads of trust, admiration, and ignorance. Even Dr. Wainwright, who had first introduced her to the deadly potential of plant alkaloids, began to recognize that Ruth had surpassed him, transforming his crude formulas into instruments of strategic vengeance. Her campaign was no longer reactive, it was proactive, designed to eliminate the remaining members of the clandestine wartime network that had betrayed her first husband, men whose wealth, influence, and immunity to ordinary suspicion made them prime targets. The speed, secrecy, and flawless execution of these deaths began to suggest a terrifying intelligence at work, one capable of exploiting both human nature and societal structures with surgical accuracy. Yet Ruth's outward persona, the grieving widow, the healer, the cultured companion, remained untouchable, her reputation as a woman of refinement shielding her from scrutiny while the threads of her vendetta were woven ever tighter. Each victory emboldened her, sharpening her sense of control, deepening her understanding of human behavior, and revealing just how fragile the structures of law, medicine, and social trust truly were when confronted with calculated, patient, and methodical intelligence operating beneath them. By the time Edward Custis, her sixth husband and a wealthy banker, died in 1789 of gastric apoplexy, Ruth Holloway had transformed from a widow into a predator whose understanding of power, secrecy, and manipulation had rendered her untouchable, leaving only the silent observers, the enslaved, the unnoticed servants, the few aware of patterns, as witnesses to the unfolding of a deliberate campaign of death that would ultimately consume 8 men and reshape the perception of what a single woman could accomplish in a society that underestimated her at every turn. By late 1789, Ruth Holloway's campaign had reached a level of deadly sophistication that even Dr. Marcus Wainwright, her former mentor in the dark art of untraceable poisons, could not fully control. Wainwright had quietly returned to Richmond under the guise of seeking a fresh start, renting a modest house on the outskirts of the city, ostensibly removed from the elite circles that Ruth now dominated. Yet his presence was no accident. He had recognized the meticulous genius behind Ruth's methods and sought to profit from her success, believing he still held leverage over her knowledge. What he failed to grasp was that Ruth's ambition and desire for vengeance had grown beyond the need for his guidance. She had internalized every formula, perfected every dosage, and developed a system of observation and execution that transformed every household she entered into a controlled environment, every husband into a subject in a precise experiment of life and death. Caesar, the enslaved observer who had quietly chronicled her activities for years, began to notice her frequent visits to Wainwright at dusk, meetings that lasted long into the night, their purpose shrouded in secrecy. Unbeknownst to anyone else, these encounters were not social, they were transactional, a continuation of the lethal knowledge trade, with Ruth paying for enhancements to her formulas while concealing her true intent, the systematic elimination of the remaining members of the secret wartime network that had betrayed her first husband. By now, the deaths of Colonel Fairfax, Captain Randolph, Judge Henley, George Carrington, Samuel Bradford, and Edward Custis had become more than mere incidents. They were signals, markers in a broader design, each one calculated to acquire wealth, consolidate influence, and maintain the illusion of innocence. Society watched her perform the role of widow, healer, and widow agé, unable to see the architecture of manipulation unfolding beneath their eyes. Wainwright, despite his knowledge, underestimated the scale of her intelligence and the intensity of her vengeance, failing to see that she was no longer a disciple but a master, and that any attempt to assert control over her would be met with the same precision and ruthlessness that had claimed 6 men already. With each encounter, Ruth absorbed more knowledge, honed her strategies, and expanded the reach of her influence, preparing to strike at the final targets, men whose positions in the network made them the most dangerous and the most valuable to eliminate. The city of Richmond, elegant in appearance and prosperous in wealth, was blind to the fact that beneath its polite drawing rooms and candlelit halls, one woman orchestrated death with the certainty of inevitability, manipulating both allies and adversaries alike, while the silent witnesses of her crimes, the enslaved, the unnoticed servants, the few who dared to observe patterns, kept the memory of her methodology alive, a testament to the terrifying power of intellect, patience, and vengeance when wielded without moral constraint. In the autumn of 1790, Richmond society was stirred by the arrival of Captain Jonathan Hale, a former Continental Army intelligence officer whose reputation for uncovering secrets and exposing betrayal preceded him. Officially, he was in the city to settle property disputes arising from loyalist confiscations, but privately he was hunting a network of men who had provided British forces with intelligence during the war, a network that included several of Ruth Holloway's previous husbands. Hale's arrival introduced an element of danger that Ruth had not yet encountered. Someone capable of recognizing patterns, connecting dots, and seeing beyond the carefully curated facades of grief and innocence she had mastered. Unlike the gentry, who accepted appearances at face value, Hale examined inconsistencies, spoke to those who had served the deceased men, and began piecing together the unspoken narrative that Ruth's husbands had shared one tragic commonality. Dr. Harrison, once a trusted friend and physician to the victims, began confiding in Hale about the strange frequency and similarity of the deaths, about the growing sense of unease he felt despite the lack of physical evidence. Hale's military training allowed him to see the choreography of the murders, the timing, the selection of victims, the way each death served both vengeance and the acquisition of wealth, and he realized that what society deemed misfortune was, in reality, an orchestrated sequence of eliminations. Ruth, perceptive as ever, recognized the threat Hale posed and adjusted her strategy, weaving her public persona with even greater care, performing grief and widowhood in ways that reinforced her untouchable image while ensuring no observer could link her to the sequence of deaths. Her interactions became more calculated, her timing more precise, and her movements within Richmond society more deliberate. Even as she balanced the need to continue her campaign of vengeance with the awareness that a skilled observer was watching, someone who might see the architecture of murder she had so meticulously constructed. Hale, though methodical and vigilant, could not yet penetrate the full extent of her planning, the depth of her knowledge of herbs, poisons, and human psychology, or the network of silent witnesses, the enslaved, the servants, and those marginalized yet observant, who preserved the memory of her methods in ways the law would never recognize. With Hale in the city, Ruth's game entered its most dangerous phase, one in which every action, every cup of tea, every public display of mourning was both performance and countermeasure, a duel of intellect and foresight, where the stakes were life, death, and the hidden truth of a society blind to its own manipulation. And yet, even in the presence of such scrutiny, Ruth's resolve hardened, her vengeance sharpened, and her mastery over the art of undetectable murder became more absolute than ever. By 1791, Ruth Holloway's campaign of calculated elimination had brought her to the final stage, a phase in which her audacity and meticulous planning converged on her seventh and eighth targets, men whose wealth, influence, and participation in the secret wartime network made them the most consequential and dangerous victims. Her seventh husband, a prominent Virginia lawyer whose ambition and cunning had once helped orchestrate betrayals during the war, fell prey to her carefully prepared concoctions administered under the guise of medicinal care. Ruth's precision was staggering. She timed doses to mimic natural illness, cultivated symptoms that could not be traced, and ensured witnesses observed her apparent grief, reinforcing her untouchable image. Within months, she had inherited yet another fortune, consolidating wealth and influence while maintaining a reputation as a refined, grieving widow. But Ruth's vision extended beyond mere accumulation. Each death was part of a broader strategy to dismantle the network that had wronged her first husband, a systemic eradication disguised beneath layers of etiquette, performance, and societal expectation. Her eighth and final target, a high-ranking colonial official whose coordination of traitorous operations had shielded the others from accountability, presented a unique challenge. He was politically powerful, scrutinized, and surrounded by allies who would notice anything amiss. Ruth approached him with the same charm, intelligence, and cultivated innocence that had ensnared the others, masking lethal intent behind the appearance of compassion and care. Every step of the courtship, every conversation, every administered remedy was calculated to maintain her cover while ensuring the fatal outcome. Yet even as she executed these final moves, silent observers recorded patterns, whispers of suspicion passing through the onslaught. Ved community, servants, and unnoticed chroniclers who bore witness to her methods, preserving the truth that society refused to see. With the 8th death, Ruth Holloway had completed not just a sequence of murders, but a systematic dismantling of a network that had betrayed loyalty and honor, transforming grief into power, manipulation into wealth, and vengeance into an undetectable force that left the world oblivious to the orchestration behind the tragedies. Her legacy, carefully concealed in plain sight, demonstrated the terrifying potency of intellect, patience, and strategic foresight when wielded without moral restraint, revealing how a single individual, armed with knowledge, observation, and psychological mastery, could manipulate entire social structures, bend human trust, and achieve control over life and death in a society that assumed its own rules were immutable, leaving behind a cautionary tale of deception, power, and the hidden costs of underestimating a mind capable of orchestrating fate itself. After the death of her 8th husband, Ruth Holloway's influence and wealth reached their zenith, yet the city of Richmond remained blissfully unaware of the true extent of her actions. To society, she was the epitome of grace and resilience, the widow who had suffered unimaginable loss while maintaining an aura of refinement and morality that few dared question. Beneath this polished exterior, however, Ruth had transformed herself into an unseen architect of power, controlling not only her own fate, but the perception of everyone around her. The estates she inherited, the fortunes she consolidated, and the connections she nurtured gave her unprecedented influence within a society still rebuilding from the upheaval of the Revolutionary War. Silent witnesses, Jupiter, Caesar, and the enslaved networks, kept a careful record of the methods she had used, passing their knowledge subtly to the next generation, ensuring that the pattern of her intelligence, cunning, and ruthlessness would not vanish entirely, even if it could not be acknowledged publicly. Dr. Wainwright, once her mentor and now a cautious observer, recognized that Ruth's mastery had eclipsed his own, her understanding of human behavior, psychological manipulation, and the undetectable application of poison elevating her to a level he could not contain or control. Captain Jonathan Hale, still in Richmond, had begun connecting dots, noting the uncanny repetition of deaths among men linked by wartime treachery, and while he suspected deliberate elimination, he could not yet assemble the complete picture, and Ruth moved carefully to keep the final threads of her design concealed. Every public appearance, every cup of tea served, every display of grief was choreographed with mathematical precision to maintain the illusion of innocence while reinforcing her social dominance. Wealth, power, fear, and admiration intertwined seamlessly in her persona, making her untouchable to legal scrutiny, immune to gossip, and virtually invisible to the law. Even as she walked through the grand homes, attended social gatherings, and was celebrated in polite society, she remained a predator whose intellect and patience had transformed vengeance into an instrument of strategic power. Her story, buried in the shadows of history, reveals how a single individual, armed with knowledge, observation, and the meticulous application of psychological and chemical methods, could manipulate social structures, exploit human trust, and execute a campaign of death with near perfection, leaving behind a legacy that, once uncovered, challenges every assumption about morality, power, and the fragility of systems that presume their own invincibility. In the years following the death of her 8th husband, Ruth Holloway's legend became an invisible current running beneath Richmond society, a shadow that whispered through the halls of power yet remained unacknowledged by those who could never see beyond appearances. Her name was spoken in polite conversation, with admiration, pity, or envy, never with suspicion, yet the patterns of her marriages and the suddenness of her husband's deaths lingered in the minds of the enslaved, servants, and discreet observers who had long recognized the method behind the tragedy. Ruth moved through society with a mastery of perception and influence that few could comprehend, using charm, intellect, and cultivated grief to maintain a flawless exterior while subtly manipulating alliances, securing inheritances, and solidifying her power. Dr. Wainwright, still in the city, had grown increasingly cautious, aware that he had empowered a force he could no longer predict or control. His knowledge of her poisons and methods was dwarfed by her own ingenuity, and he understood that any attempt to challenge her could be fatal. Captain Jonathan Hale continued his investigations, piecing together fragments of evidence, sensing a deliberate orchestration in the deaths of the men linked by wartime treachery. Yet the complete tapestry of Ruth's vengeance remained just out of reach, obscured by her strategic patience and meticulous orchestration. Meanwhile, Ruth's daily life became a performance of the highest order, hosting salons that influenced political thought, participating in charitable endeavors that enhanced her reputation, and cultivating friendships that concealed her true intentions, all while maintaining control over the lethal knowledge she had acquired and perfected. Her legacy, though invisible to the law and public records, was encoded in the silent network of observers who had survived. Her orchestration, in the hidden vials and journals, in the whispers of those who saw patterns too dangerous to speak aloud. Richmond itself, a city still recovering from revolution, remained blind to the lessons Ruth Holloway had imparted about trust, power, and the exploitation of societal blind spots. Her story demonstrated that intelligence, patience, and an understanding of human psychology could bend the seemingly immutable rules of law, morality, and social expectation to the will of one individual. By mastering every element of perception, influence, and lethal precision, Ruth Holloway had created not just a series of deaths, but a living, breathing demonstration of the fragility of human systems when confronted by a mind capable of orchestrating events with both invisibility and inevitability, leaving a legacy of fear, respect, and unacknowledged power that would echo silently for generations to come. Even decades after Ruth Holloway had claimed her final victim, the echoes of her campaign persisted in the hidden corners of Richmond society, a quiet terror recorded only in the memories of those who had dared to observe, note, and speak in whispers. The enslaved and servants who had witnessed her meticulous preparation of remedies, the subtle manipulations of circumstance, and the controlled execution of her vengeance had passed their knowledge cautiously from one to another, forming a clandestine oral archive that outlived the witnesses themselves. Rumors surfaced sporadically among the gentry, whispered in private drawing rooms and private parlors, but always dismissed as coincidence, superstition, or the imagination of those too sensitive to the fragility of life. Meanwhile, Dr. Marcus Wainwright, aware that he had played a hand in creating a master of lethal subtlety, left Richmond. Yet the fear of Ruth's potential reach lingered in his consciousness. He knew that her understanding of plants, poisons, and human psychology had surpassed his own, and that any attempt to confront her could end with his silence, permanent and undetected. Captain Jonathan Hale, still pursuing leads on the network of wartime traitors, sensed a dark pattern behind the deaths, but the full scope remained obscured, a tapestry of vengeance and cunning that only Ruth herself could fully understand. Historians, chroniclers, and casual observers who later encountered fragments of records, obituaries, and scattered journals were confronted with the impossible task of discerning truth from carefully constructed appearances. The public narrative, shaped by grief, social expectation, and Ruth's own performance, obscured the mechanisms of death and inheritance that lay beneath. Her journals, hidden behind locked doors and secret compartments, detailed formulas, dosages, and observations in the language of a healer, yet encoded for lethal application, demonstrating a calculated blend of science, psychology, and artistry in the orchestration of human mortality. To anyone who would later stumble upon these writings, the revelation was unnerving. Ruth Holloway had transformed grief into power, manipulation into mastery, and vengeance into a system that exploited the vulnerabilities of both human bodies and societal structures. She had created a blueprint for control that transcended morality, one that could be applied to wealth, influence, and reputation with precision, invisibility, and inevitability. And while the city moved on, the silent witnesses, those who had seen the methodical destruction, the ritualized administration of fatal remedies, the orchestration of public perception, carried forward a dangerous awareness, the knowledge of one woman's ability to navigate, manipulate, and dominate both human trust and institutional blind spots, leaving behind a legacy that, once uncovered, challenges everything we assume about power, intelligence, and the fragility of human systems when confronted by singular genius applied without conscience. As the decades passed, Richmond society slowly evolved, but the shadow of Ruth Holloway's orchestration remained embedded in its hidden histories, a story carefully excised from public record yet preserved in fragments by those who had observed, survived, or remembered. Official investigations into sudden deaths of prominent men never connected the dots, dismissed as natural illness or misfortune, while Ruth's carefully curated persona shielded her from scrutiny. The journals she had meticulously kept, filled with formulas that could heal or kill, were hidden behind false walls, secret compartments, and locked chests, surviving only through careful concealment and the memory of enslaved and observant servants who understood, without words, the gravity of what they had witnessed. Dr. Marcus Wainwright, long gone from Richmond, could only marvel at how his former pupil had transcended his own knowledge, transforming the methods he had taught her into an autonomous system of vengeance, precision, and power. Captain Jonathan Hale, whose intelligence work had initially hinted at the larger truth, could never reconstruct the entire sequence of events, yet his records suggest he sensed the presence of a mind that operated beyond ordinary comprehension, capable of predicting, manipulating, and exploiting human behavior with surgical accuracy. In private homes and whispered conversations, tales of the widow who buried 8 husbands persisted as cautionary legend, dismissed by polite society, yet preserved in subtle folklore, a reminder of how a single individual's intellect, patience, and unrelenting will could manipulate entire networks of power and trust. By the early 19th century, when workers discovered the 8 wooden boxes hidden beneath the floorboards of a decaying tobacco warehouse, the revelation that Ruth Holloway's legacy had been carefully documented in both physical, and social artifacts shocked historians and authorities alike. Rings, vials, and journals, all meticulously labeled, organized, and preserved, revealed the precise method behind her lethal operations, confirming what had only been whispered in fear and speculation for generations. The magistrates who sealed these findings understood the danger of knowledge made public. The exposure of a woman who had mastered death, deception, and social manipulation with such methodical skill could destabilize the fragile trust upon which post-revolutionary Virginia society rested. For over 2 centuries, this case remained locked away in the archives of the Virginia Historical Society, hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic suppression and societal discomfort, a record of a truth too disturbing for polite conversation. Ruth Holloway's life, crimes, and meticulous orchestration of death challenge every assumption about morality, intelligence, and the fragility of human systems, demonstrating that a single calculated mind, armed with knowledge and patience, can bend reality to its will while leaving behind a trail invisible to all but the most observant, a cautionary testament to the terrifying power of intellect and vengeance when combined with absolute control over perception and circumstance. Ruth Holloway's mastery extended far beyond poisons and inheritance. It was a psychological conquest of perception itself, a demonstration of how a single individual could manipulate human observation, societal expectation, and legal systems simultaneously, all while remaining untouchable. Every gesture, every word, every display of grief was calculated not just to convince witnesses of her innocence, but to reinforce their own assumptions, exploiting the cognitive blind spots inherent in human judgment. She understood the predictable behaviors of men in positions of power, the limitations of physicians constrained by contemporary medical knowledge, and the unquestioning trust society placed in appearances, and she wielded this understanding as a weapon. Ruth's interactions with servants, enslaved networks, and even casual acquaintances were carefully orchestrated to maintain secrecy. Subtle instructions, controlled access to her vials, and the cultivation of silent observers ensured that those who might notice too much could never piece together the entire design. She exploited social norms, knowing that a widow of wealth and refinement would be beyond reproach, that expressions of grief could shield her from suspicion, and that society's reverence for feminine delicacy would mask lethal intent. Even Dr. Wainwright, her former mentor, recognized that she had transcended the lessons he taught, applying knowledge not merely to cause death, but to manipulate perception and control narratives, to turn ordinary human observation into a tool for her invisibility. Captain Jonathan Hale, methodical and trained in intelligence, could sense patterns, notice inconsistencies, and document the unusual, but he lacked the full understanding of the interplay between Ruth's social acumen, her command of botanical toxins, and her psychological manipulation, leaving him perpetually a step behind. Her genius was in the synthesis: chemistry, observation, social strategy, and psychological insight fused into a system where death, performance, and perception operated as one seamless mechanism. Those who encountered her, even fleetingly, were drawn into the illusion she constructed, unconsciously reinforcing her facade while recording in the deepest recesses of memory the subtle signs of method and intent. Ruth Holloway's story demonstrates a terrifying truth about power and intellect: that control over perception can be as lethal as any physical weapon, that invisibility in plain sight can be achieved through understanding human cognition, and that a mind attuned to manipulation, patience, and strategic foresight can orchestrate events, dominate systems, and bend the world to its will, all while leaving society blind, law impotent, and history silent until centuries later, when the buried evidence finally emerges, revealing not just a serial killer, but a master of human psychology, societal structures, and the lethal interplay between knowledge and power. When the 8 wooden boxes were finally uncovered beneath the rotting floorboards of the Richmond tobacco warehouse in 1811, the contents shocked even the most seasoned historians and antiquarians who examined them. Inside, the vials of white powder, each paired meticulously with a husband's wedding ring and carefully labeled with dates, revealed the precision and forethought behind Ruth Holloway's reign of silent terror. The powders, when analyzed by contemporary standards, were found to be untraceable by ordinary medical examination, a lethal alchemy disguised as herbal medicine, capable of inducing symptoms mimicking natural illness and leaving no discernible cause of death. Her journals, leather-bound and ink-stained, chronicled each husband's ailments, reactions to dosages, and observations on timing, all recorded with a methodical rigor that transformed murder into an almost scientific endeavor. The magistrates who reviewed the discovery, recognizing the potential scandal and the implications for the families involved, immediately sealed the case, ordering that the boxes and writings remain hidden from public record, a suppression that ensured Ruth Holloway's crimes remained largely unknown for generations. Yet even in secrecy, the evidence exposed a truth that would haunt anyone who glimpsed it. Ruth had operated with absolute control over life, death, and perception, manipulating social structures, exploiting human trust, and bending legal and moral expectations to her will. The symbolism of the 8 rings, paired with the powders, was unmistakable to those trained to see patterns: a deliberate record, a signature of mastery, an assertion of dominance over both men and the society that had so easily been deceived. Historians who later stumbled upon references to the sealed case could piece together fragments of the narrative, uncovering not just a sequence of murders, but a deliberate campaign of psychological and social manipulation executed over decades. Ruth Holloway's legacy, buried in part by institutional suppression and in part by the complacency of society, challenges fundamental assumptions about morality, justice, and the limits of human observation, demonstrating that a single individual, armed with knowledge, patience, and an understanding of human behavior, could manipulate entire networks of power, orchestrate death with near-perfect invisibility, and leave behind a historical record that remained invisible until curiosity, chance, or determination unearthed it. The story is not merely of murder, but of mastery, of perception, influence, and the terrifying precision of intellect applied without ethical restraint, a cautionary testament to the hidden forces that can shape history and human fate from the shadows. Long after Ruth Holloway's life ended and her physical presence faded from Richmond's streets, the memory of her methods persisted quietly, carried through the careful whispers and coded recollections of servants, enslaved observers, and those who had witnessed her lethal precision firsthand, ensuring that even in the absence of official documentation, her legacy could not be entirely erased. These oral networks, often dismissed by society as superstition or gossip, contained detailed observations of her habits, the way she always prepared remedies herself, the strict compartmentalization of her ingredients, the long solitary walks she took to gather herbs that she treated as secret treasures, and the near ritualistic administration of her formulas to each unsuspecting husband. Within these narratives lay the blueprint of a mind that had mastered both chemical lethality and psychological manipulation, a system so precise that those who survived its edges instinctively understood the danger, yet could neither confront it nor record it openly. Even Dr. Marcus Wainwright, who had once guided Ruth in the experimental uses of poisons, could only watch from a distance as she perfected a discipline he could never hope to contain, transforming theoretical knowledge into applied mastery, turning grief into theater, and shaping the perception of entire households to serve her purposes without resistance. Captain Jonathan Hale, with his intelligence training and analytical mind, remained an outsider, capable of recognizing patterns and suspecting deliberate orchestration, but unable to penetrate the layers of social control, fear, and calculated illusion that Ruth had woven around herself and her environment. Over time, the story of Ruth Holloway became both legend and warning among those who understood, a silent testament to the terrifying potential of human intellect applied without moral restraint. Her work demonstrated that mastery over human perception, through charm, strategic grief, the careful crafting of trust, and the meticulous application of chemical knowledge, could bend society itself to a single individual's will. These surviving oral histories, when combined with the eventual rediscovery of the vials, rings, and journals, form a chilling record of how power can be exercised invisibly, how the facade of civility can conceal predation, and how the lessons embedded in Ruth's actions continue to resonate as a study of control, patience, and the terrifying efficiency of intellect applied to human mortality. For those willing to see, her life is not simply a story of death, but a masterclass in manipulation, strategy, and the unacknowledged vulnerabilities inherent in human systems, revealing that the most dangerous forces are often invisible, operating quietly within the very structures that claim to maintain order, justice, and morality. Ruth Holloway's calculated orchestration of death and perception left an indelible mark on Richmond society, shaping the collective understanding of widows, wealth, and the subtle exercise of power long after her disappearance from public life, influencing both fear and admiration in ways that society could never openly acknowledge. In the years following her final husband's death, women of refinement were quietly scrutinized with an almost paranoid suspicion, and widows of means were measured not just by their social grace, but by their potential for influence, manipulation, and control over those around them, an invisible benchmark set by Ruth's methodical brilliance. Families became more cautious in their alliances, observing rituals, appearances, and behaviors with heightened attention, recognizing that charm, intellect, and outward grief could mask lethal intent. Ruth's impact extended into legal and social assumptions. Her exploitation of inheritance laws, the limitations of medical knowledge, and the blind trust of society in appearances exposed structural weaknesses that could be manipulated with patience and cunning. Scholars and social observers who later examined patterns of sudden deaths among the wealthy elite began to speculate on the existence of individuals capable of manipulating both perception and circumstance to such perfection that they could escape accountability, even in plain sight. Her mastery of psychological control demonstrated that power is not merely wielded through force or wealth, but through the ability to bend belief, trust, and expectation to one's will, creating a system where the observer becomes complicit yet unaware in the unfolding of events. Oral traditions among servants and enslaved networks preserved these lessons with almost ritualistic reverence, noting patterns of behavior, methods of concealment, and the precise timing of lethal interventions, a living archive of human cunning and cruelty. Even centuries later, historians piecing together the fragments of evidence, vials, journals, letters, and the occasional corroborating anecdote, struggle to comprehend the full extent of Ruth Holloway's intelligence, foresight, and audacity. The lessons embedded in her life are timeless. That control over perception, mastery of social systems, and patience in execution can surpass brute force. That intellect applied, without conscience, can bend society itself, and that the legacy of such mastery persists in subtle echoes, influencing assumptions, behaviors, and fears in ways that outlive the individual. Ruth Holloway's story is not merely a cautionary tale of murder, but an exploration of the terrifying efficiency of knowledge applied strategically, a reminder that human systems, legal, social, and moral, can be manipulated by those willing to operate in shadows while maintaining the illusion of light, leaving a mark on history that is invisible to those untrained in observation, yet undeniable to anyone who studies the patterns closely. The true scope of Ruth Holloway's influence can only be understood by examining the quiet, often invisible network of observers who documented her actions in fragmented whispers, secret writings, and carefully memorized accounts, preserving a knowledge that the official records and polite society deliberately ignored or suppressed. Enslaved individuals, household servants, and attentive neighbors acted as unwitting chroniclers, noting the precise way she prepared her remedies, the insistence on controlling every ingredient, and the deliberate timing of her administrations, all of which combined to create a system of death cloaked in domestic normalcy. Their observations, passed through oral tradition and subtle coded communication, maintained the memory of her methods long after she herself vanished from Richmond's streets, ensuring that the pattern of calculated manipulation and lethal precision could not be entirely erased by time or bureaucracy. This network functioned like an underground intelligence system, documenting anomalies, inconsistencies, and repeated patterns in ways that were invisible to the gentry, yet meticulously preserved within the community that truly understood the danger. Even Dr. Marcus Wainwright, who had once taught Ruth the rudiments of chemical lethality, could not fully grasp the sophistication she achieved in combining botanical knowledge with acute psychological insight, nor the audacity with which she manipulated perception, law, and social expectation to her advantage. Captain Jonathan Hale, despite his training and investigative skill, remained perpetually a step behind, able to trace patterns only partially and to sense the methodical genius that orchestrated events with terrifying efficiency. These surviving oral records became a hidden archive, a collective memory that transmitted lessons about observation, caution, and the potential for unseen forces to dominate human systems. For modern historians, the challenge has been immense. To reconstruct the deliberate architecture of Ruth Holloway's actions from vials, journals, and scattered witness accounts, to discern intent from coincidence, and to recognize the genius of her strategy without sensationalizing or diminishing the cold precision of her control. Her life demonstrates the terrifying potential of intellect, patience, and social mastery. A single individual, armed with knowledge and an unerring understanding of human behavior, can operate undetected, bend entire households and communities to her will, and leave behind a legacy that quietly shapes perception, morality, and fear for generations. Ruth Holloway's story endures not only as a record of death and manipulation, but as a study in the hidden architecture of power, the imperceptible mechanisms of control, and the ways in which human systems, legal, social, and moral, can be bent, exploited, and dominated by a mind that understands both the chemistry of the body and the psychology of the observer. Ruth Holloway's genius was not limited to chemistry or strategic planning. It extended deeply into the realm of psychological warfare, a mastery of human perception and trust that allowed her to execute her lethal designs while maintaining the unassailable guise of innocence. She understood the predictable patterns of grief, sympathy, and social expectation, using them as tools to manipulate entire households, medical professionals, and even entire social circles, ensuring that suspicion never coalesced into accusation. Every expression of sorrow, every fainting spell, every carefully worded explanation of her husband's ailments was designed to reinforce the illusion of vulnerability while masking premeditation, creating an almost hypnotic effect on observers who were unconsciously complicit in their own deception. Ruth exploited the assumptions of physicians like Dr. Harrison, knowing that medical knowledge of the era was limited and that symptoms could easily be attributed to natural causes. She timed her interventions so that no contemporary analysis could detect her hand, and she cultivated the perfect persona of the refined, grieving widow, a figure untouchable because society could not conceive that such intellect and poise could coexist with murderous intent. Her interactions were layered with subtle persuasion, a tone of urgency to override reason, gestures of care to override suspicion, and demonstrations of knowledge to command trust. Even those trained to detect deception, like Captain Jonathan Hale, could sense only fragments of the pattern, unable to fully map the orchestration of her murders, because Ruth controlled not just the events, but the narrative itself, bending perception and expectation simultaneously. Her psychological methods extended to her communication with servants and the enslaved network she relied upon for observation. She subtly signaled boundaries, enforced silence, and created a system of controlled knowledge, ensuring that information moved only along channels she could monitor. Ruth's life is an unparalleled study in the lethal combination of intellect, patience, and social manipulation, revealing that mastery of human psychology can be as deadly as any poison, that perception can be weaponized, and that a mind attuned to social nuance, timing, and influence can operate above suspicion for decades. Her story demonstrates an unsettling truth. The most dangerous power is often invisible, embedded in influence, trust, and carefully orchestrated perception, and Ruth Holloway exploited every human weakness with a precision that transformed murder into an art form and invisibility into a tool of domination, leaving a legacy that haunts history not through spectacle, but through the silent, meticulous control of minds and the subversion of human systems. Ruth Holloway's manipulation extended beyond the private spaces of her households and into the very fabric of Virginia's society, exploiting rituals, public sympathy, and the rigidity of inheritance law to cement both her wealth and her untouchable status, ensuring that each death reinforced her position rather than inviting scrutiny. Funerals became stages on which she performed grief with meticulous precision, orchestrating her body language, her speech, and her interactions with attendees to evoke maximum empathy while subtly controlling the narrative around each husband's demise. By appearing vulnerable and pious, Ruth shielded herself from suspicion, transforming tragedy into a tool of social influence. The legal framework of the era, particularly regarding widows and inheritance, became another instrument of her strategy. The rapid transfer of property, wealth, and social capital following each husband's death increased her resources, while simultaneously embedding her deeper within elite networks, where questioning her conduct was unthinkable. Her knowledge of societal expectation, coupled with her understanding of law, created a protective armor around her actions. She could maneuver through the legal and social systems with confidence, knowing that any overt accusation would collide with her cultivated image of propriety, innocence, and refinement. Even minor deviations from her prescribed behavior were calculated, creating plausible explanations for observers, while every seemingly compassionate act reinforced trust. In this way, Ruth Holloway weaponized appearances, morality, and social norms to build a shield as lethal as her chemical preparations, ensuring that suspicion was deflected, analysis delayed, and intervention prevented. Her brilliance lay not only in killing, but in ensuring that the social, legal, and psychological consequences of her actions were absorbed into the fabric of society, leaving her free to continue her campaign with increasing efficiency and audacity. Each marriage, each funeral, each display of grief was a step in a meticulously planned ascent to ultimate power and control, demonstrating a level of strategic foresight rarely seen, where intellect, observation, and social engineering combined to create a system in which Ruth operated above detection. By turning grief into theater and societal expectation into a weapon, she revealed the terrifying potential of human systems to be manipulated from within, illustrating that mastery over perception, law, and social ritual can be just as deadly as mastery over poison, and that the most profound influence often lies not in what one does overtly, but in what one orchestrates invisibly, bending the world to their will while leaving others blind to the design. Ruth Holloway's selection of her next victims was never random. Each husband was meticulously chosen based on a convergence of wealth, influence, and vulnerability, a calculated strategy that ensured not only their deaths, but the expansion of her power and the consolidation of her social dominance. She targeted men who carried secrets, financial, political, or moral, that made them particularly susceptible to manipulation, men whose public personas were carefully constructed, yet whose private weaknesses could be exploited with precision. The first months of courtship involved subtle observation, gathering information from servants, acquaintances, and correspondents, as she mapped the patterns of her prospective victims' habits, health, and vulnerabilities. Ruth understood that knowledge was power, and in these preliminary investigations, she acted as both predator and analyst, dissecting human behavior with surgical accuracy while presenting herself as a compassionate, intelligent, and sophisticated partner. Her interventions were timed with mathematical precision. Remedies were administered at moments when natural symptoms could be plausibly claimed. Social attention was managed to control narrative, and external witnesses were positioned to validate her innocence. Even her own emotional expressions were instruments of strategy, calibrated to evoke trust, sympathy, and a sense of inevitability, ensuring that her influence extended beyond the immediate sphere into the broader society, shaping perception and deflecting suspicion. Each death was therefore not an isolated act, but the final phase of a long, deliberate orchestration in which she controlled the flow of information, manipulated the assumptions of doctors and witnesses, and exploited the limitations of human observation. The result was a series of fatalities that appeared coincidental, almost natural, yet reflected a deeper logic of cause and effect designed entirely by Ruth's intellect. This systematic approach reveals a terrifying lesson: that power is most potent when invisible, when the mechanisms of control are hidden within ordinary interactions, and when society itself unwittingly reinforces the predator's strategy. Ruth Holloway's legacy, therefore, is not only a record of murder, but a masterclass in strategic patience, psychological insight, and social engineering, showing that the true art of domination lies in understanding human behavior so completely that you can bend events, people, and even law to your will, leaving only the faintest trace of design for those who might later attempt to reconstruct the truth from fragments, whispers, and suppressed records. The collaboration between Ruth Holloway and Dr. Marcus Wainwright was a subtle and perilous dance, a convergence of knowledge and ambition that pushed the boundaries of secrecy, control, and lethal precision. Yet it was Ruth who remained the master architect, dictating the terms and timing of every operation. Wainwright, once a disgraced physician whose experiments had rendered him both infamous and exiled, brought to Ruth the technical expertise of chemical lethality, a collection of botanical and mineral formulas that could mimic natural disease with terrifying accuracy. But while he viewed their partnership as mutual, Ruth understood that his value lay solely in his knowledge and that ultimate authority over outcomes rested with her. She manipulated the dynamic with an almost theatrical subtlety, demonstrating deference and interest when he sought influence, yet always steering his contributions toward her singular vision of control, revenge, and accumulation of wealth. Meetings at his modest home were orchestrated to maintain secrecy, with timing and location carefully chosen to avoid observation, and conversations layered with coded language that concealed intent even from those trained in analysis. Ruth's mastery was evident not only in her understanding of poisons and human physiology, but in her ability to control Wainwright himself. She permitted him access to her growing empire of influence while ensuring that any suggestion of expansion or deviation from her plan was either subtly ignored or redirected in a way that benefited her alone. Through this partnership, Ruth perfected the integration of lethal knowledge with social engineering, combining chemistry, psychology, and societal norms into a single coherent strategy that allowed her to eliminate threats, consolidate assets, and manipulate perception simultaneously. Wainwright's presence also served as a convenient alibi and justification for her methods. The existence of an expert consulting on remedies lent credence to her innocence, shielding her from suspicion while providing a controlled channel for acquiring new techniques. This intricate interplay reveals Ruth Holloway not merely as a killer or manipulator, but as a strategist whose understanding of human systems extended beyond the immediate to the structural, who could anticipate reactions, exploit weaknesses, and orchestrate events with a precision that transformed ordinary social and domestic structures into instruments of domination and control. Her story with Wainwright demonstrates that true power does not require brute force. It requires mastery over knowledge, loyalty, perception, and timing, a lesson that echoes across centuries in the shadows of human history. With each successive marriage, Ruth Holloway refined her methods, escalating both the scale of her influence and the sophistication with which she operated, transforming the simple act of matrimony into a mechanism of social, financial, and psychological control. Every husband she chose was assessed for wealth, connections, and vulnerability, their habits and personal histories meticulously catalogued in her private journal, creating a detailed matrix that allowed her to predict responses to her interventions with terrifying accuracy. She applied the lessons learned from previous unions, altering dosages, timing, and presentation of her lethal preparations to reduce suspicion while maximizing effect, all the while cultivating a persona of elegance, grief, and compassion that disarmed even the most discerning observers. Funeral rituals became rehearsed performances in which every gesture, every word, and every tear was calculated to reinforce her innocence and manipulate public sentiment, ensuring that sympathy translated into elevated social standing and deeper integration into elite circles. The slaves, servants, and occasional confidants who observed her actions became part of a silent network of witnesses, their notes, anecdotes, and whispers forming a hidden archive that preserved the methodology of her influence and the precision of her timing, a testament to the meticulousness of her craft. Legal instruments, particularly wills and inheritance laws, were manipulated with equal skill, ensuring that property, land, and wealth flowed seamlessly into her control while leaving no actionable evidence of wrongdoing, creating a system where the law, intended to protect, unwittingly reinforced her power. Even minor missteps in her environment were anticipated and controlled. Meals, medical consultations, and social interactions were carefully staged to maintain plausible deniability, and any deviation from expected outcomes was reframed through narrative, persuasion, and calculated grief. The resulting effect was a web of control in which every aspect of society, the legal system, social networks, medical knowledge, and human perception, was subtly bent to her will, creating a sphere of influence that expanded with each calculated union. Ruth Holloway's brilliance lay not in brute force or overt domination, but in the orchestration of trust, perception, and timing, demonstrating that lethal power can be exercised invisibly through intellect, observation, and patience, and that the manipulation of systems, both human and structural, can achieve results far more absolute than violence alone, leaving a legacy of influence, fear, and awe that would ripple through history long after the final vial was emptied and the last husband buried. As Ruth Holloway's deadly campaign progressed, the invisible network of observers, the enslaved, the household staff, and a few cautious neighbors, began to piece together patterns that no single outsider could detect, whispering among themselves about the uncanny timing, the repetition of symptoms, and the consistent presence of Ruth at the moments her husbands fell ill, forming a clandestine archive of knowledge that existed entirely outside the official records and the polite society that celebrated her grief. These whispers, while fragmented and coded to avoid retribution, slowly converged into a tapestry of suspicion, a quiet acknowledgement among those who truly saw the machinery behind the facade that the widow's hand was more than coincidence. Even as Ruth perfected her performances of sorrow and elegance, these subtle traces of recognition became increasingly difficult to suppress, threatening to illuminate the method behind the deaths she orchestrated with such meticulous care. Captain Jonathan Hale, whose intelligence work had already positioned him as a potential threat, now found corroboration in these fragmented accounts, sensing the outlines of a deliberate campaign where previously there had seemed only luck or fate. The slaves' coded communications and the servants' notes formed an informal surveillance system, noting everything from the precise composition of medicinal teas to Ruth's solitary forays into the surrounding countryside, returning with herbs whose identities were known only to her, and cataloging the reactions of each husband to her preparations. The convergence of these accounts created a dangerous possibility. If connected, they could expose a pattern so deliberate, so methodically executed, that it would dismantle the illusion of innocence she had cultivated over years of careful manipulation. Ruth, however, was acutely aware of the threat, had posed by collective observation, and adjusted her tactics accordingly, enhancing the plausibility of every action, ensuring that grief, sympathy, and public expectation continued to shield her, while simultaneously monitoring the watchers with the same precision she applied to her husbands. This delicate interplay between predator and unseen chroniclers transformed the social environment into a high-stakes chessboard, with Ruth controlling nearly every move, while the observers struggled to capture a truth concealed beneath layers of performance, fear, and societal blindness, revealing the terrifying power of an individual who understands both human behavior and the invisible architecture of social systems, capable of operating above suspicion even as the very world around her begins to sense the dark rhythm of her influence. Ruth Holloway's mastery extended into the legal and social frameworks that governed Virginia society, allowing her to manipulate not just individuals but entire systems, transforming suspicion into reinforcement of her power and ensuring that the slow accumulation of whispers never crystallized into actionable evidence. She understood that the laws regarding inheritance, widowhood, and property rights were structured to favor the grieving widow, and she exploited these statutes with calculated precision, ensuring that every husband's death immediately enhanced her wealth and social standing while leaving no legal opening for challenge. Wills were drafted, revised, and executed under her careful guidance, with timing and phrasing designed to maximize her gain while minimizing scrutiny. and she cultivated relationships with lawyers, clerks, and social arbiters who unwittingly reinforced the appearance of propriety, their assumptions about her grief and virtue blinding them to the orchestration behind the deaths. Social perception became another layer of protection. The elite family she mingled with were invested in maintaining the illusion of her innocence because it reflected upon their own judgment, their hospitality, and their understanding of civility. To question Ruth was to risk social embarrassment or the suspicion that they themselves had misjudged morality. Even when minor doubts surfaced, they were absorbed and neutralized through her theatrical displays of sorrow, charm, and cultivated intelligence, reinforcing trust while discouraging scrutiny. This strategic manipulation of law and social expectation meant that the system itself became a shield, creating an environment in which suspicion was deflected, investigation delayed, and opportunity for intervention minimized. Ruth's brilliance lay not only in the acts of elimination, but in her orchestration of the structures surrounding her victims, bending rules, customs, and human assumptions into instruments of protection and amplification, demonstrating that true power often resides not in overt action, but in the subtle alignment of societal mechanics to one's own ends. Through these layered defenses, she transformed potential exposure into reinforcement, turning observers' expectations, legal loopholes, and social norms into extensions of her lethal strategy, a chilling demonstration of how intellect and perception can dominate systems, manipulate outcomes, and operate above accountability, leaving behind a legacy that challenges our understanding of morality, justice, and the invisible architecture of control that governs human societies. As Ruth Holloway's campaign of calculated elimination approached its apex, her final husbands became the most intricate exercises of her lethal artistry, combining every lesson learned over decades into a singular display of psychological, chemical, and social mastery, each union meticulously engineered to deliver maximum gain while minimizing exposure. These men were not merely wealthy or influential. They were linchpins in the network of traitors who had betrayed her first husband, figures whose deaths would both satisfy her long-simmering revenge and further entrench her position in Virginia's elite. Ruth approached each with the precision of a strategist, learning their routines, vulnerabilities, and social pressures, while crafting remedies and rituals designed to mimic natural illness, timed perfectly to the rhythms of daily life, so that even the most attentive observers would perceive coincidence rather than design. She layered her interventions with psychological nuance, employing charm, empathy, and subtle coercion to ensure compliance, trust, and eventual vulnerability, turning domestic intimacy into a vector of control and lethality. Even as whispers among servants and slaves began to recognize the emerging pattern, Ruth maintained her facade of innocence, grief, and refinement, using public sympathy as both shield and weapon, knowing that society's investment in her story made scrutiny socially costly and psychologically improbable. The final executions were marked by an almost ritualistic elegance, measured doses of plant-based toxins, carefully timed ministrations, and the orchestration of witnesses, all synchronized with a deep understanding of human perception to prevent detection. In parallel, Ruth continued to manipulate legal documents, social networks, and the public narrative, ensuring that each death translated into wealth, influence, and label status, while leaving the traceable mechanisms of murder entirely obscured. The cumulative effect was a web of destruction and accumulation, a convergence of intellect, patience, and observation that made Ruth Holloway not merely a serial killer, but a master architect of systems, a woman who wielded knowledge, psychology, law, and perception as instruments of absolute power. In these final acts, her genius lay in the integration of all her skills into a coherent, nearly flawless mechanism of domination, demonstrating that true mastery of human systems can render one untouchable, turning grief into theater, law into armor, and social expectation into a weapon, leaving behind a legacy that forces the observer to confront a terrifying truth: that intellect, patience, and understanding of human behavior can create a predator whose influence extends far beyond the immediate victims, shaping perception, history, and memory itself. Despite Ruth Holloway's meticulous orchestration, the first fissures in her invincibility began to appear as Captain Jonathan Hale, trained in intelligence and pattern recognition, started connecting the dots that most of Virginia's elite had either ignored or dismissed, recognizing that the string of deaths following Ruth's marriages was not mere coincidence, but a deliberate campaign executed with extraordinary precision. Hale's investigation relied not on rumors alone, but on careful observation, corroborating testimony, and a deep understanding of human behavior, allowing him to perceive the subtle consistencies, the timing of illnesses, the recurring symptoms, the widow's presence at critical moments, and the uncanny replication of prior methods across different households. Servants and enslaved observers, whose warnings had long been dismissed, became hidden allies, providing fragments of evidence that, when assembled, revealed the contours of Ruth's lethal strategy, from her solitary excursions to gather herbs, to her insistence on personally preparing remedies, to the precise management of witnesses and funerary rituals. Even Dr. Marcus Wainwright, whose complicity had once seemed indispensable, could not mask the inevitability of exposure as Hale traced the chemical signatures, behavioral patterns, and social engineering techniques that Ruth had relied upon for decades. The elegance of her public persona, grief-stricken widow, learned healer, sophisticated socialite, was now vulnerable to systematic scrutiny, and the very structures she had manipulated, from inheritance law to social expectation, were being re-examined under the lens of a mind trained to see hidden designs. Yet Ruth's genius remained formidable. She anticipated observation, deployed misdirection, and continued to exploit societal blindness, maintaining plausible deniability even as Hale's suspicion crystallized, illustrating the terrifying interplay between intellect and investigation, predator and observer. Her actions now entered a new phase, no longer solely a campaign of accumulation and elimination, but a calculated defense against revelation, demonstrating that the most dangerous minds are not only capable of executing perfect crimes, but of adapting to scrutiny, manipulating perception, and bending even the instruments of detection into tools that reinforce their continued survival. In this convergence of pursuit and concealment, Ruth Holloway reveals the ultimate lesson of her life: that mastery over human systems, psychological manipulation, and societal norms can create a force nearly impervious to challenge, and that even as observers close in, the predator who understands both human behavior and structural systems may still operate above detection, leaving only fragments of truth for those bold enough to assemble the narrative from shadows, whispers, and historical traces. The unraveling of Ruth Holloway's meticulously constructed empire of death began subtly, almost imperceptibly, as Captain Jonathan Hale and his growing circle of observant allies started to assemble the fragments of evidence scattered across Richmond's households, stitching together a tapestry that revealed the pattern, precision, and scale of her lethal orchestration. Every detail mattered. The repeated presentation of medicinal teas, the timing of her solitary excursions to collect rare herbs, the uncanny similarities in the symptoms and timing of each husband's demise, and the consistent management of witnesses and servants to maintain the facade of innocence. Hale cross-referenced social calendars, medical consultations, and personal journals, discovering that Ruth's methods were not haphazard but executed according to a sophisticated understanding of human behavior, chemical lethality, and societal expectation. The slaves' and servants' whispered records, once dismissed as superstition or gossip, now formed a vital subtext, a secret archive that, when combined with legal documents and observed patterns, created an unbroken chain pointing toward deliberate murder. Ruth, ever calculating, sensed the subtle shift in the social air, the quiet glances, the probing questions, the careful avoidance of certain conversations, and she responded with the same precision she had applied to her killings, adjusting doses, rehearsing grief, and manipulating those around her to maintain plausible deniability. Yet the pressure was mounting, and cracks began to form in the protective layers of perception she had so carefully engineered. The convergence of analytical minds, accumulated observations, and historical records created a framework in which her past actions could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. In these moments, the interplay between predator and pursuer reached a new intensity, illustrating the dangerous truth that even the most brilliant manipulator is vulnerable to an observer who can perceive patterns, anticipate tactics, and trace the invisible threads of control. Ruth Holloway, whose intellect had turned ordinary households into instruments of dominance and death, now faced the stark reality that her mastery over law, perception, and human behavior was being challenged by minds equally meticulous and relentless, revealing the terrifying duality of power. That domination depends not only on skill, foresight, and secrecy, but also on the continued blindness or ignorance of those around you. And when that blindness begins to fade, even the most perfect predator must confront the possibility of exposure, resistance, and the collapse of carefully constructed illusions. As the net of observation tightened around her, Ruth Holloway shifted seamlessly into the role of strategist, defending a crumbling facade, deploying a series of countermeasures designed to manipulate perception, misdirect inquiry, and reinforce the illusion of innocence even under increasingly critical scrutiny. She meticulously curated interactions with servants, neighbors, and witnesses, orchestrating casual conversations, subtle gestures, and staged acts of grief that reinforced the narrative of a bereaved widow beset by tragedy rather than deliberate design, exploiting the social expectation that a woman of her refinement and position could not possibly be a perpetrator. Ruth also began to manipulate physical evidence with surgical precision. Vials of suspicious powders were hidden, disposed of in ways that seemed accidental or natural, and her herbal collections were reframed as ordinary medicinal remedies, their lethal potential camouflaged beneath the veneer of socially accepted healing practices. Simultaneously, she cultivated alliances within the local elite, leveraging influence, charm, and subtle coercion to ensure that those with even the faintest suspicion were either silenced or redirected, their doubts reframed as misunderstanding or envy, turning society itself into a buffer against discovery. In her interactions with Dr. Marcus Wainwright, she maintained strict control over knowledge flow, using him as both a supplier of expertise and a scapegoat for any inquiries that threatened to uncover the full scope of her operations, demonstrating that her genius was not only in execution but in contingency management and strategic foresight. Meanwhile, Hale and his allies continued their meticulous reconstruction of events, tracing patterns, timelines, and anomalies that suggested deliberate orchestration, forcing Ruth to anticipate and neutralize every potential point of exposure, a high-stakes game of intellect, observation, and psychological maneuvering. This battle between predator and investigator highlighted the frightening reality of Ruth Holloway's genius. Her lethal power was not simply in chemical mastery or social manipulation, but in her ability to operate within and bend the very systems designed to detect wrongdoing, exploiting human assumptions, societal norms, and the predictable behaviors of others to create a near impenetrable shield. Yet with every adjustment, every feigned display of sorrow, and every subtle act of misdirection, the tension escalated, revealing the paradox at the heart of her strategy. The more perfectly she concealed her intent, the more she drew attention from those capable of perceiving the hidden logic of her actions, setting the stage for an inevitable confrontation between the brilliance of a methodical killer and the relentless analytical mind of those determined to unravel her deadly symphony. As Captain Jonathan Hale's investigation gained momentum, Ruth Holloway found herself navigating a shrinking margin for error, each carefully calculated move now shadowed by the relentless scrutiny of a mind trained to detect pattern, motive, and method, forcing her into maneuvers of increasing risk and sophistication to maintain her impervious facade. Every household visit, every preparation of remedies, every interaction with neighbors and elite acquaintances became a delicate balancing act, where one misstep could unravel years of meticulously constructed illusion. Hale's methodical approach, cross-referencing social engagements, funeral records, witness accounts, and subtle anomalies in timing and behavior, slowly delineated the architecture of her campaign, revealing the terrifying precision with which she had orchestrated not just deaths, but perceptions, alibis, and social narratives. Ruth responded with a combination of psychological acumen and tactical deception, leveraging charm, feigned grief, and social leverage to influence witnesses, redirect attention, and control the flow of information, while simultaneously refining her chemical preparations to avoid patterns that could now be traced back to her. The invisible network of observers among the enslaved and household staff, once fragmented and cautious, now became an unintentional asset to Hale, as their whispered records and subtle confirmations allowed him to anticipate her methods and predict her next moves. Ruth's alliance with Dr. Marcus Wainwright, once a comfortable source of expertise and collusion, began to fray under the pressure of exposure, forcing her to assert control with quiet intimidation, ensuring compliance while maintaining plausible deniability. Each calculated risk she took reflected her understanding that survival required not just mastery of chemistry and social perception, but an ongoing manipulation of investigation itself, transforming pursuit into a chess match where foresight, misdirection, and psychological dominance dictated every outcome. The tension escalated to a point where the widow's lethal elegance, which had once allowed her to operate above suspicion, was now tested by the relentless analytical gaze of Hale, demonstrating the fragile interplay between brilliance and exposure, predator and pursuer, and revealing a chilling truth, that even the most methodical and intelligent orchestrator of death can be cornered by an equally disciplined mind, forcing decisions that, while preserving immediate safety, risk unraveling the entire empire of deception and revealing the full, horrifying scope of a life lived in the shadows of murder, manipulation, and social engineering. The confrontation between Ruth Holloway and Captain Jonathan Hale was not a violent clash, but a battle of intellect, observation, and psychological dominance, each fully aware of the stakes. For Ruth, exposure meant the collapse of decades of power, wealth, and influence. For Hale, failure meant the continuation of a pattern of death disguised as coincidence, and the haunting knowledge that a master manipulator had operated unchecked within the heart of Virginia society. Ruth approached these encounters with the same calculated elegance that had defined her entire life, presenting herself as the refined, grief-stricken widow, while subtly probing Hale's understanding, testing the boundaries of his suspicions, and attempting to guide his conclusions with half-truths, charm, and carefully constructed distractions. Hale, in turn, relied on meticulous observation, patience, and his ability to perceive nuance in human behavior, noting small inconsistencies in timing, tone, and ritual, slowly peeling away the layers of deception that Ruth had cultivated over decades. Their interaction became a psychological chess match, Ruth employing misdirection, social manipulation, and controlled displays of emotion to maintain her shield, while Hale traced patterns, connected fragmented evidence, and anticipated her next moves with relentless precision, creating a tension that crackled beneath the surface of polite society, invisible to all but those attuned to the deadly stakes. Ruth's genius now extended into defensive strategy, anticipating questions, managing appearances, and leveraging the predictable assumptions of those around her, while simultaneously observing Hale for weaknesses or miscalculations she could exploit. Yet, for the first time in her life, the widow faced the relentless pressure of an intellect as disciplined, patient, and analytical as her own, a force capable of reconstructing her methods, understanding her motives, and exposing the system of control and manipulation she had spent decades perfecting. This confrontation highlighted the terrifying equilibrium between predator and pursuer, where brilliance alone does not guarantee survival, and where the margin between continued dominance and total exposure is determined by insight, observation, and the courage to follow patterns others cannot or will not see. The encounter set the stage for the final unraveling of Ruth Holloway's empire of death, illustrating that even the most meticulous orchestrator of human systems can be challenged when their hidden architecture is illuminated by persistent scrutiny, and that the legacy of control, manipulation, and lethal intelligence can be confronted, questioned, and ultimately brought to light, no matter how deeply buried it has been within the shadows of society, law, and perception. The culmination of Ruth Holloway's decades-long campaign of calculated death and manipulation unfolded not with fanfare, but with a chilling inevitability, as the intricate web she had woven began to unravel under the steady scrutiny of Captain Jonathan Hale and the network of observers who had painstakingly documented every pattern, every anomaly, every carefully concealed act. Even as Ruth moved with her characteristic grace, maintaining the outward appearance of a grieving, learned widow, the invisible threads of her empire began to fray. Servants whispered more cautiously but more insistently. Social circles that once shielded her started questioning coincidences too remarkable to ignore, and Hale's careful cross-referencing of timelines, medical notes, and personal correspondences began to converge into an irrefutable narrative of deliberate design. Ruth's chemical artistry, her mastery of social perception, her psychological manipulation of husbands, witnesses, and elite society could no longer operate in isolation. Each act of misdirection, each staged display of grief, and each meticulous poisoning now faced the cold, systematic reconstruction by a mind trained to see the architecture beneath the illusion. The tension reached its apex when Hale began to confront her indirectly, presenting inconsistencies and subtle proofs that challenged the very foundation of her reputation, forcing Ruth into increasingly complex maneuvers, from staged alibis to the reallocation of suspect substances, while simultaneously assessing the loyalty and observation of every individual around her. In these final moves, the widow's intellect was tested like never before. She had to maintain social dominance, evade legal and social consequences, and anticipate investigative strategies that operated on a level of pattern recognition and psychological insight equal to her own, a rare battle of human intelligence against human intelligence. Yet, even in this climax, her brilliance was undeniable. She adapted, misdirected, and controlled perception with uncanny precision. But the relentless pressure of exposure, combined with the cumulative weight of observation, history, and emerging evidence, created cracks in the empire she had spent a lifetime constructing. Ruth Holloway, once untouchable, faced the terrifying realization that knowledge, intellect, and power, when wielded without restraint or accountability, may eventually encounter forces capable of matching and even surpassing them, and that the systems she had manipulated, social expectation, legal ambiguity, and human perception, could be turned against her by those willing to see beyond the carefully constructed shadows of her lethal genius. The stage was set for the final reckoning, where the deadly elegance of her life would collide with the unyielding pursuit of truth, illuminating the dark extremes of intelligence, obsession, and moral corruption, and leaving behind a haunting testament to the consequences of wielding forbidden knowledge with cold precision. The final exposure of Ruth Holloway was as methodical and inevitable as the deaths she had orchestrated, a culmination of decades spent manipulating perception, exploiting trust, and bending social and legal systems to her will, now undone by the unrelenting scrutiny of Captain Jonathan Hale and the quietly vigilant network of witnesses whose observations, once ignored, converged into undeniable evidence of her orchestration. As Hale presented the meticulously documented connections between each husband's death, the chemical signatures of her lethal remedies, and the patterns of her social manipulation, the illusion of the grieving learned widow began to collapse, revealing the cold intellect and calculated cruelty that had allowed her to operate with near impunity. Society, which had once elevated her as a paragon of refinement and virtue, now recoiled in horror as the threads of her deception were laid bare, showing how she had exploited assumptions, societal blindness, and the very structures designed to maintain order to commit crimes that defied both detection and belief. Ruth's mastery of psychology and chemistry, the careful cultivation of public sympathy, and her strategic alliances with complicit figures like Dr. Marcus Wainwright were insufficient against the relentless logic and observation of those determined to see the truth, proving that even the most sophisticated manipulation cannot fully withstand the convergence of insight, persistence, and pattern recognition. As the magnitude of her actions became clear, the consequences rippled beyond her own downfall, exposing the vulnerabilities of a society built on appearances, assumptions, and the willful ignorance of inconvenient truths, leaving a chilling legacy of fear, fascination, and cautionary awareness that would echo through generations. The widow who had once seemed untouchable now became a symbol of the peril inherent in unrestrained intellect, ambition, and moral corruption, and her story served as a stark reminder that power achieved through deception, manipulation, and secret knowledge carries an inherent risk that someone, somewhere, will eventually notice, connect, and expose the hidden architecture of control, forcing the predator to confront the inevitability of consequences and the fragile illusion of invincibility. Even as Ruth's personal fate was sealed, the narrative she had woven continued to shape the consciousness of those who studied it, a testament to the dangerous allure of forbidden knowledge, the enduring impact of human cunning, and the relentless pursuit of truth by minds willing to pierce the shadows of history. In the final reckoning, Ruth Holloway's story became more than a chronicle of murder and manipulation. It transformed into a dark meditation on power, intelligence, and the human capacity for both cruelty and ingenuity, a lesson etched into the very fabric of history for those daring enough to perceive it. Her meticulously orchestrated life, built upon the deaths of 8 husbands, the exploitation of societal assumptions, and the artful manipulation of perception, revealed the terrifying potency of knowledge wielded without moral restraint, demonstrating how intellect, charm, and strategic patience can be weaponized to reshape reality itself. Yet, even as she had controlled her world with chilling precision, the relentless scrutiny of observant minds like Captain Jonathan Hale and the once dismissed network of household witnesses proved that no system of deception is flawless, and no predator remains invisible forever. The very patterns that ensured her dominance became the threads that unraveled it, exposing the intricate architecture of control she had spent decades perfecting. The consequences of her actions echoed far beyond her own fate, challenging assumptions about justice, trust, and human behavior, while serving as a haunting reminder that the pursuit of hidden knowledge carries both empowerment and danger, and that those who operate in the shadows may be undone by the light of insight, pattern recognition, and relentless observation. Her story resonates today not merely as a historical curiosity, but as a psychological mirror, forcing men and women alike to confront uncomfortable truths about the allure of control, the fragility of social perception, and the moral responsibility inherent in intelligence and influence. Ruth Holloway, the widow who outlived 8 husbands through calculated means, leaves behind a legacy that is as instructive as it is terrifying, revealing that mastery over life and death comes at the price of perpetual vigilance, and that even the most carefully concealed truths can be reconstructed by those willing to look deeper, think critically, and connect the hidden dots of human behavior. Her tale stands as a chilling testament to the power of intellect, the seductive danger of forbidden knowledge, and the enduring truth that history, though it may hide the deeds of the cunning and ruthless, ultimately bears witness, exposing the dark genius of those who believe themselves untouchable and reminding us all that the shadows we inhabit can be illuminated by those who refuse to look away.